My name is Tahir. I'm going to be a Zoom moderator. The session will be recorded and put on YouTube later on. So, with further ado, I would like to request Dr. Yousaf Sheikh to take over from here. He's the president of APPNE, which is the Association of Pakistani Physicians in New England. Over to you, Dr. Sheikh.
Thank you, Tarsap. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, panelists. This is our third webinar in a series of webinars we have been doing since the pandemic started, to improve the health education of our community. We have an excellent panelist today. One is the hematologist and oncologist, Dr. Khanani, Dr. Naaznin Lokhandwala, she's endocrinologist, Dr. Khadija Chaudrey, she is an gastroenterologist, Beth Cronin, she is our registered dietitian. I was looking at the PubMed today. There are more than 136,000 articles on fasting, and more than half of them were published in the last 10 years. So there's a spike in the interest of research scientists, physicians, and public and fasting. And with the help of panelists, we will today learn what are the good things about fasting and what should be the consideration we should do before we start fasting. So Muzzamal Habib will be our moderator. Dr. Muzzamal, please take over from you now.
Thank you, Dr. Sheikh. I'm so excited to have a wonderful panel of experts in their fields, which will help us to answer all those questions. It's intermittent fasting is very fashionable, very in these days. We're rather than just listening to people from industry, I think it'd be wonderful to hear from professionals what they think about fasting, how it impacts, how it affects our human body, how our health, and not only health, but also spiritually. Our first speaker in our panel is Dr. Naaznin Lokhandwala. She is a clinical endocrinologist and diabetologist in practice since 2002. She is currently part of Stewart Healthcare. She is based in Methuen, Massachusetts, and serves as a consultant endocrinologist at Tewksbury State Hospital. She also had co-founded a Glucose Trail, which is a charitable organization dedicated to diabetes care in low resource settings. She was born in Portland, Oregon, but moved to Pakistan when she was young. She was only 12 years old. She graduated from a well-known medical school, Aga Khan University Hospital in 1993, and she did her residency in Beth Israel Medical Center in Boston. She did her endocrinology fellowship in Leahy Clinic, and she has continued to not only work as a practitioner, but also travel to South Asia, and had spent nearly 2 years doing sabbatical from 2009 to 2011 in Karachi, working on diabetic care, health, and wellness. Her trans-global experiences have taught her the importance of contextual health, especially in treating the chronic diseases like diabetes. She is very committed to patient empowerment through education, financially sustainable health solutions, and preservation of health and wellness to optimize the quality of life and personal productivity. Similarly, our next speaker in our panel, Dr. Khadija Chaudhry, is a well-known gastroenterologist. She graduated from King Edward Medical University in Lahore, Pakistan. She did her residency training in SUNY Downstate Medical Center, New York, and a fellowship in gastroenterology at Mayo Clinic. She is currently working as a gastroenterologist at Leahy Clinic in Burlington, Massachusetts, and her clinical interests are colorectal cancer, Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, pregnancy, colitis, and inflammatory bowel disease, and ulcerative colitis in pregnancy. Our third speaker, Dr. Khanani, a wonderful hematologist and a friend. He graduated from Dow Medical College in Karachi, Pakistan. He did his residency training in St. Vincent Hospital and a fellowship in hematology oncology at UMass Medical Center, Worcester, Massachusetts. He has been part of Worcester community for about 3 decades and currently is a participating hematologist and medical oncologist at Hayward Hospital in Hayward, Massachusetts. Our last panelist, but not the least, is Beth Cronin. She is a registered dietitian. She is a local coordinator for Stewart Holy Family Hospital Diabetes Care Program, where she provides diabetes education and diabetes medical nutrition therapy. Originally, she is from Wisconsin, and her education included an undergraduate degree in dietetics with minors in psychology, which still serves her well, and biology from the University of Wisconsin, Saud. Clinical dietetic internship at New England Deaconess Hospital, and MS in nutrition from Birmingham State College. She had been certified diabetic educator since 1990 and has worked closely with Dr. Lokhandwala for several years. Dr. Lokhandwala sports lifestyle as foundational medicine for diabetes and routinely refers her challenging patients to Beth. Nutrition therapy is most effective when personalized and culturally sensitive. Beth is grateful for Dr. Lokhandwala's support and gift of Indian cooking lessons. With this introduction, I will pass on the helm to our first speaker, Dr. Lokhandwala. Dr. Lokhandwala, it's all up to you.
Assalamu alaikum. I am really honored, and it's my distinct pleasure to serve as a panelist on such an important topic like fasting. I really thank APPNE for arranging this webinar. I'm very excited to hear my other colleagues, specialists in other disciplines of medicine, to hear what they have to say. We have all come together from different specialties to speak about the single topic of fasting. I am an endocrinologist, and my main focus will be on diabetes during this presentation. I also want to especially thank Beth for joining us. She is knowledgeable and a true professional, and but she's also kind and gentle, and has definitely transformed lives. So with this, I'll begin my presentation. People with diabetes who are requiring multiple doses of insulin daily, or if people are on mixed types of insulins and they're taking that twice daily, or if we're dealing with a diabetes patient who has other serious medical conditions, including congestive heart failure, chronic kidney disease, or painful neuropathy. I'd be happy to answer in the question and answer period why it is important to avoid fasting in these conditions, but we'll move along for the sake of time. I'm going to now invite Beth to cover the next few slides on the foundational therapy for diabetes, which is diet. You can move to the next slide.
Okay, the first slide is on hydration, and it is very important during the 7 hours or so between the evening meal and the next morning to get in about 6 to 8 glasses of water. Sugary beverages, and I will address this in just a little bit, tend to promote higher blood sugars and insulin response, and we would prefer that these be non-caloric or at least not sugary beverages. So water, perhaps something like Crystal Light, herbal tea, milk can be used as well as some of the liquids. And as we talk about some of the meal elements, doing things like a smoothie, and that might be made with milk or evaporated milk, has doubled the protein because it is dehydrated or lower in water. That could be used as a smoothie base, or even something like Glucerna. So if I could have the next slide, what I would like to emphasize here is that it's very important to have nutrient-dense foods. And this is true for anyone, but especially when the 2 meals per day need to be very complete. And during this time of pandemic, there are some nutrients that are really important to support immune health. And they include protein, vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, and selenium. And it is very important to try to get these nutrients from food sources as opposed to supplements, because we believe that when we consume foods, there is more value than this in the foods than the sum of their nutrients. For instance, we're getting things like fiber and phytonutrients when we eat a balanced diet. So if we think about the traditional plate, it's about a half plate of what we call non-starchy vegetables, about 1/4 plate protein, and about 1/4 plate starch. However, this is modified somewhat, and if I could have the next slide, for the cereal or the morning meal, we do want to have adequate protein. And this might be in the form of, you can see some of the protein sources, vegetable omelets, nut butters, Greek yogurt, which generally packs about 10 to maybe even 12 grams of protein per 6 ounces, cottage cheese or lean meat. This meal also should have some whole grains. Oatmeal would be a good choice. We do recommend, though, having something like the steel cut oatmeal, or at least the whole rolled oats, rather than the little convenience packets that are often very sugary and very refined. Also, lentils or a lentil soup, may be a good addition to the morning meal. Fruits, we would like to include berries, especially for their antioxidant properties, bananas, apples. Again, these could be made into smoothies with milk, evaporated milk, or yogurt. For those individuals who need to have more blood sugar control or a steady release of blood sugar, the glucerna can be a nice addition. It's about 200 to 300 calories depending on the product. It is a good source of protein and other nutrients. And for those who are frail or at risk of losing weight, this may be a perfect addition. So if I could have the next slide. For the evening meal, we're back to the more traditional plate. Protein sources may be plant-based, as well as lean poultry or fish or lean meat. The carbs should be whole grains. This would be more like brown rice or other whole grains, quinoa, for instance, and fruits and vegetables. We also need to have some heart-healthy fats, and that might be in the form of nuts. Some nuts are especially good sources of zinc and selenium. And we also encourage the green leafy vegetables for their nutrient value, and smaller portions of fresh fruits. I think I'm going to give this back to Dr. Lokhandwala at this time, and I will be happy to answer questions toward the end of the program.
So we
Back to Dr. Lokhandwala. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so you could go to the next slide, please. So another part of the foundational therapy for diabetes, apart from diet, is physical activity. If you have already been engaging in some form of moderate physical activity, you can continue to do that. The key word is moderate, because you will be engaging in this activity after a whole day of fasting. So probably a walk at a moderate pace would be a good example of moderate activity. And that should be done about 30 to 60 minutes prior to iftari or the evening meal, because you will be able to hydrate yourself after that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through the slide fairly quickly and leave this more to question answer period. But when it comes to diabetes medications, there are a group of diabetes medications that may not have to be changed during the course of fasting. And that's because these group of medications make you more sensitive to your own insulin that your body is making. And it only improves the augmentation of the insulin when you're actually eating, but not during the fasting state. And so they don't really, they cannot cause a low blood sugar under normal circumstances. Examples of those medications include metformin or some of the, or Januvia or Trulicity, if you've heard of those medications. The medications that definitely need adjustment, either in their dose or the timing, or may need to be discontinued, is sulfonylureas like glipizide, which actually force insulin out of your pancreas, whether you're eating or not. So it can put you at risk of having a low blood sugar. Insulin needs to be, the dose of insulin needs to be adjusted, and the timing that you take the insulin may need to change. And there is a certain new medication that has come onto the market, which examples include Jardiance or Invokana. These group of medications actually filter glucose into your urine, and in so doing, they pull water out into the urine as well, and it can put you at risk of being dehydrated. And one of the important stipulations of taking this medication is that you remain very well hydrated. And so I do not recommend that you continue this medication during the fast. Next slide, please. But what I'd really like to talk about today in the last few minutes of my presentation is mental strength. Mental strength is something that I really work with the patients that I serve, and trying to harness mental strength is one of the most powerful tools to manage chronic disease. The people that, those folks of us that have diabetes or gain weight easily or have cancer do not have these problems because it is our fault. It's actually been written in our genetic constitution. Because of what's written in our DNA, we may have a proclivity to developing some of these chronic illnesses. But our behavior that is within our control can be used to possibly prevent these diseases, can be used to mitigate the negative impacts of these diseases, and can certainly be used to control these diseases if we have them. And so it is mental strength, which is one of the most powerful tools that I try to harness in the patients that I serve. And fasting actually turns out to be a very important tool to do that. Next slide, please. So we all have heard of this dictum, mind over matter. This actually emerged in the English language around 1863. It was by Sir Charles Lyell who first described this. And it really points to the fact, can we overcome instinctive desires? And can we actually overcome circadian biological rhythms? But this actually was not discovered in 1863. This was actually written in scriptures in ancient spiritual philosophies, in the scriptures of the Abrahamic faiths, and it has clearly been revealed to our Holy Prophet Muhammad in the Holy Quran. And so next slide, please. So this is something that my mother taught me ever since I was a little girl, and it is what the Prophet Muhammad's cousin, a great intellect, Maulana Ali, has said, that Allah the Exalted gave the angels intellect without desires. He gave the animals desires without intellect, and he gave both to humans. So a man whose intellect prevails his desires is better than the angels. And there's a little bit more to the quote, but suffice it to say that that our Creator created us differentiated from all the other creations on earth. And it is during the fast that we actually realize the mental willpower and the intellect that our Creator has bestowed upon man. And what the fast actually calls upon us to do is to really combat normal instincts. And these instincts come from a deep center in the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus actually sits on top of our master endocrine pituitary gland. And from the hypothalamus, there are deep centers that drive hunger and thirst and sexual desire and emotions. And during the fast, and even governs our biological rhythms. And during the fast, everything that we're doing is completely against a normal instinct. And that is our way in discovering our mental capacity to overcome those instincts with our intellect and our mental strength. And so for many of our young adults, perhaps one of the most difficult parts of fasting is awaking in the wee hours of the morning when we're in the deep REM sleep and our wakefulness hormone, which is cortisol, is at its lowest ebb. And we have to pull ourselves out of bed at that time and will ourselves to nourish ourselves with seri so that we can last for the duration of the fast. We have to combat instincts like hunger, thirst, sex, and anger. And we even have to control our thoughts further, that when we feel that hunger pang, or when we feel that discomfort of thirst, we're called upon to reflect on the condition of other human beings that are undergoing hardship other than ourselves. And we're called upon to be charitable. And so that is why fasting really helps us to discover this hidden mental strength. Next slide, please. And so as I have been a student of science for all these years, and especially in my subject of endocrinology, I really am left awestruck that truly our Creator and our Maker knew best. And as it was revealed to us in this chapter of the Holy Quran, that our Maker told us that we must learn self-restraint, and it is better for you that ye fast, if ye only knew. And he sent us clear signs and guidance, and he also explained to us the stipulations on what we should do to complete the fast. Next slide, please. And so I would like to end with a slide to reiterate the fact that fasting unlocks a supreme mental potential. It helps us discover our ability to be selfless. It helps us to discover self-restraint. And so when we begin the fast at seri time, we begin it with a niyat, or an intention. And it's with utmost humility that we sort of state to our Maker and our Creator, because the fasting is a very personal relationship with yourself and your Creator. And we begin with a niyat to please help us to complete this fast. And when we break our fast at iftari, we complete it with a level of gratefulness that we were able to achieve this milestone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lokhandwala. I think now we will request Dr. Chaudrey. He's a gastroenterologist, and to speak based on her specialty and her expertise.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be joining my other esteemed panelists to be talking to you all through the APPNE platform about fasting and GI health. Next slide, please. So approaching fasting and weight loss, even though fasting is partaken a lot of times for religious or spiritual reasons, intermittent fasting is becoming a rapidly accepted mode of weight loss. So when we talk about intermittent fasting, they can be broadly categorized in two categories. One is alternate day fasting and the other is time restricted feeding. Alternate day fasting alludes to non-fasting days when the individual is eating ad libitum, and on the fasting days there often is a caloric restriction that is observed, anywhere from 25% less calories that you would eat otherwise, or even lower than that. Time restricted fasting is when you stop eating after a particular hour of the day, and the Ramadan fasting, which is the holy month in the Islamic calendar, is in sync with the time restricted feeding. As Naaznin was mentioning early, Sehri is the first meal, and then Iftar is the evening meal. So what is the scientific evidence behind using intermittent fasting for weight loss? It's important to understand that the studies have given mixed results. When you compare alternate day fasting with no caloric restriction group, there are studies that show that there could be up to a 5-kilogram weight loss over a 12-week period. The question still remains, is this sustainable? We don't have data to support that yet. There are other studies that compare alternate day fasting with time restricted fasting and then no fasting groups. And there is no significant difference in the weight loss between these individuals. So with that said, fasting is an accepted mode for weight loss, especially if done properly and under the supervision of a trained individual. It has benefits of weight loss and other additional health benefits. Next slide, please. So an interesting question that I get from friends and family members who have fasted for 30 days of Ramadan and have not lost a single pound, and sometimes it actually goes in the opposite direction because they gain weight, is that why did I not lose fast when I was fasting for 12 plus hours of the day for 30 days? So when you're using, fasting in Ramadan to have a secondary gain of weight loss, you still have to understand that the basic concept of putting in less and exerting out more still applies. And usually during fasting times, we are sedentary, trying to conserve our energy. The exercise level is not the same. But often the evening meal on a Southeast Asian iftar table looks like what I have shown on the slide. It's very carbohydrate rich, it's very sugary. For example, a veggie samosa, which is a very staple food during the month of Ramadan, one samosa could have up to like 260 calories. And I will tell you, we delve in having more than one samosa because they're just so yummy. So adding up all these calories, and one hidden ingredient is the sugar that is added to the tea, or even other products like fruit chaat often takes a lot of sugar. The beverages that are consumed around iftar time also have added sugar to them, and all of this adds up. And often you have your evening meal and then you're going to the bed right away. So one still has to understand that, as was mentioned earlier, to keep a healthy plate, foods that are not caloric dense. What that means is that if you were to compare two bowls, that one had fresh grapes and the other one had dried grapes, in order to feel full by eating both of them, you probably have to eat less of the fresh grapes because they have water in them. They fill you up faster. So if you're really going to have fruit chaat at iftar, just have a bowl of regular fruit instead of adding sugar to that. So still, it's important whether you're doing a fasting during Ramadan and hoping that you'll lose some weight, or whether you're using intermittent fasting to lose weight. It's important to understand that what you're putting in is going to impact your end goal. Next slide, please. An important benefit of fasting is on the liver. So normally when we eat, our body uses glucose as its primary fuel, which comes from carbohydrates. In the state of fasting, when you are primarily depriving yourself of glucose, The pancreas, which is an organ that produces a lot of enzymes and juices that help with digestion, produces less insulin and more glucagon. As a result, the fuel has to come out of the fat cells that are stored inside the liver, and that fuel is called ketone. So during fasting state, we are producing more ketones from the liver by using fat in the liver. And then those ketones go to the bloodstream and they are used as a primary fuel by the brain and the muscles and other body organs. So when you are fasting, you're actually leaching out that fat from the liver, which if stays in the liver can have detrimental effects on liver health. Next slide, please. There is scientific evidence, though there is more to be known, that fasting does decrease inflammation in our body. So there are many different types of cells in our body. Some cause inflammation and some prevent inflammation. One of these cells is called monocytes. These are the cells that cause inflammation in our body. And there are studies that show that during fasting, these monocytes go in a state of sleep. And as a result, there is less inflammation in the body during the fasting state. As I said, there's more research to be done, but there's a very strong signal that fasting decreases inflammation in our bodies. Next slide, please. And a very hot topic these days in the field of gastroenterology is the concept of microbiome. Microbiome is the different bacteria that we have in our gut. There are more than 100 trillion bacteria in your gut. Some are good, some are bad. But there are studies that show that during the fasting state, the good bacteria go up in number and the bad bacteria that cause inflammation in our body decrease in amount. Therefore, as the future scientific research evolves, we will know more about how fasting changes the bacteria in our gut and helps our body fight inflammation. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention. I hand it back to Muzzamal.
Okay, thank you. It was wonderful. And we will continue with our question answer session towards the end of our panel, towards the end of our presentation. So our next speaker is Dr. Khanani. He is a very well-known hematologist and oncologist, and not only a wonderful physician, but also a wonderful human being and wonderful friend. Dr. Khanani, it's all up to you.
Thank you so much, Muzzamal. Let me first compliment my three co-panelists for their wonderful presentations while I struggle with bringing my video on. Naaznin has covered quite a bit of the spirituality that will save time. And Khadija made a very astute remark that I want to highlight again, that there is scientific evidence, but there is more to be known. We will never know enough, as Shakespeare has mentioned, that there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in your philosophy. So there are more things to be known even in the field of medicine. And the work done by one generation is passed on to the next to carry on. And this is how science develops. So there are statistics, and someone said that statistics are the greatest liars. It's mentioned that 44% of the studies which are published today will be proven to be incorrect 5 years down the road. But we have what we have, and we have to build upon it. Instead of bombarding you with all the scientific evidence, not all the scientific, but most of the scientific evidence that I could gather from reading different articles, I will be highlighting a few things only which are written in red over here. So my presentation is actually in two parts. The first is the medical aspect, which is my profession, and the second is the spiritual part, which is my patient. In 2020, an estimated 1.8 million new cases of cancer were diagnosed. Here it says will be, but we are already past it, a year that everybody wants to forget. And more than 600,000 people will have died from this disease. Prostate, lung, and colorectal cancers account for more than 40% of all cases. Breast cancer is the #1 cancer in women. The cancer death rate is 158 per 100,000 men and women per year. And the cancer mortality rate is higher among men than in women, mostly due to lung cancer and prostate cancer. But one phenomenon that we are all experiencing is the increasing number of cancer survivors. So cancer survivorship poses its own challenges, including mental burden, financial burden, not to the patient, but also to the community, and the increasing risk of second cancers. There will be about 16.9 million cancer survivors in the United States, and that number is likely to increase by more than 50%. Approximately 40% of men and women will be diagnosed with cancer at some point during their lifetime. And although this is not the primary objective of fasting in religious terms, this is becoming more and more apparent that fasting may have a very profound impact on decreasing the incidence of a variety of cancers. The estimated national expenditure for cancer care is astronomical 151 billion, and it is likely to increase in future. The similar statistics apply to the world at large as well, and by 2040, the number of new cases is expected to rise to 29.5 million, and the number of deaths, 16.4 million. That's a huge number. Generally, the cancer rates are highest in countries whose populations have the highest level of life expectancy, and there is a human development index that I will be talking about. Actually, let me just mention that it was a Pakistani economist, Dr. Mahbubul Haq, who came up with a statistical composite index. He called it the HDI, which takes into account the life expectancy, educational level, the level of income, and it divided the countries into 4 tiers. And those who are in the higher tier seem to have higher incidence of both obesity and cancer. But it is hard now to define what is a poor country, because even in what we consider to be underdeveloped or developing or poor countries, obesity is now increasing and the incidence of cancer is also increasing. We do not have longitudinal studies to really know the impact of fasting on decreasing the cancer rate. So what are the challenges that we oncologists face when we are dealing with a patient with cancer? Obviously, prevention of cancer is the prime importance. Early diagnosis and appropriate treatment. And Naaznin Chaudrey's art of colonoscopy has saved many lives. Minimizing the side effects of treatment, where fasting has an important role to play. Cancer survivorship and the financial burden to the community and the individual. So if we can prevent cancer, if we can minimize the toxicity of chemotherapy, and if we can decrease the incidence of second cancers, you can imagine the economic benefits on the community and the world at large. Now, I'm indebted to Dr. Lokhandwala for bringing to my attention the work of Yoshinori Oshumi, who won a Nobel Prize in 2016 in cell biology, and he described a process known as autophagy, or which is a Greek term for self-eating, or you can say self-destruction, that during starvation, cells break down proteins and non-essential components and reuse them for energy, as Naaznin had mentioned, that with the increased production of gluconeogenesis, of glucagon, there is gluconeogenesis where the body fat is converted into glucose for providing energy. And as a result, it leads to weight loss. The cells also use the same process to destroy invading viruses. Does fasting have an effect on COVID? I don't know, but I had COVID last year, right around Ramadan, and I was able to fast. So I don't know. And cells use autophagy to get rid of damaged structures as well. And this is the process that goes haywire in cancer, infectious diseases, immunological diseases, as well as neurodegenerative diseases. Cancer cells feed on the body. They are parasites, and they have a survival advantage. They depend upon specific metabolites, and fasting, or the FMDs, the fasting mimicking diets, they can lead to wide alterations in growth factors and in metabolite levels, generating environments that can reduce the capability of cancer cells to adapt and survive, and thus improving the effect of cancer therapies. And it includes all those metabolites that Dr. Chaudrey mentioned, the decreased level of insulin, increased level of glucagon, and so forth. Fasting, or FMDs, increase resistance to chemotherapy in normal, but not in cancer cells. And this is a concept that is being studied in more and more detail. In fact, one of the first studies on this topic came from Saudi Arabia, that they took 16 patients during the month of Ramadan, which is the Muslim month of fasting, and they gave them fasting for a limited period of time with diet modification, and gave them chemotherapy for cancers, and found that it did not have any untoward effect on their health. And in fact, it was able to provide benefit in terms of dealing with the side effects of chemotherapy. It was a very small study of about 19 patients, but it has led to more wider studies as well. While fasting is hardly tolerated by patients, both animal and clinical studies show that cycles of low-calorie FMDs are feasible and overall safe. And this is a concept in the fasting, as I will mention in the spiritual part. Several clinical trials, as I mentioned, are actually evaluating the effect of fasting and FMD on treatment emergent adverse events and on efficacy outcomes, but these will require longitudinal studies like Sears data, which can go on for 10, 15, 25 years, in order for us to know what meaningful impact it has on decreasing the incidence of cancer. The systemic response to fasting is already mentioned that it leads to low levels of glucose and insulin, increase high levels of glucagon and ketone bodies, low levels of insulin growth factor 1, which is actually quite important, and leptin, as well as high levels of adiponectin. And again, I don't have the expertise to discuss all of these in detail. Gone are the days when I used to memorize, or all of us used to memorize those Krebs cycle pathways and so forth. It's very hard to memorize now. Now, what's the cellular response to fasting? The highlighted thing, increased lifespan and health span, which means both the quantity of life and the quality of life can be improved by fasting. It's not starvation. It's not imposing hunger on people. It actually has its benefits. And fasting and FMDs have the ability to promote regenerative effects by molecular mechanisms, some of which have been implicated in cancer, such as increased autophagy or induction of another metabolite, certain activity. So what are the dietary approaches in cancer? And they, as Naaznin had mentioned, that there are statistics, there are studies, and more is to be known, and we really cannot come to any meaningful conclusion as to what should be the optimum duration of fasting. Should it be 48 hours? Should it be a few hours? Should it be limited to 300 to 11,000 calories per day? But typically, the way scientific studies are being developed is to mimic the chemotherapy cycle, which is usually 3 to 4 weeks. So patients who are getting chemotherapy every 3 to 4 weeks will be given a modified fasting diet with more water for a day, 1 to 5 days prior to starting chemotherapy. So they are not being starved, but their diet is being modified with emphasis on water so that they don't become dehydrated. And there is a growing interest in the possibility that certain calorie-limited diets that Beth was mentioning could become an integral part of cancer prevention. So the diet that Beth had shown is not just for people who are fasting for as a religious obligation, but in terms of cancer management as well. Obesity and cancer. And obesity is estimated to account for 14% to 20% of all cancer-related mortality. It has an effect not only on the incidence of cancer, but it has also a huge impact on increasing the mortality. And at least in breast cancer, it has been shown that if women who have breast cancer, and they've survived, if they do not lose weight, if they continue to be obese, their risk of cancer recurrence increases. And a study has shown that there is an increased risk of 13 types of cancer that we know, which are linked with obesity. Intermittent fasting trials and obesity, there was a review by Canadian Family Physician Journal in which they did a meta-analysis of 27 trials, and they found that intermittent fasting is a moderately successful strategy for weight loss. Will it translate into decreasing the cancer incidence and increase survival and increase tolerance to chemotherapy? Remains to be proven. Now comes the spiritual dimension of fasting. There was a time when I was in medical school and training that it was a taboo to discuss spiritual and religious aspect in doctor-patient interaction. But spirituality has made a comeback, and it is being integrated into the curriculum of many of the medical schools. Religious and spiritual beliefs and practices are important in the lives of many patients, and it is now actually encouraged to have a discussion on these issues within certain boundaries. Obviously, we are not supposed to impose our thoughts on our patients in terms of our belief system, but we have to keep into mind the religious beliefs and practices of the patients. If they ask us to pray, we should pray with them. In fact, one of the most touching stories that I actually came across was an oncologist was taking care of a nun, and she had failed all lines of treatment. And the doctor was to discuss the last days with the patient. And at the end, he said, would you like me? Is there anything I can do for you? And the nurse said, doctor, would you pray with me? And they both kneeled down, they prayed, and their eyes were gazing at God. So why do people fast, or why should people fast? Why do Muslims fast? Why 1 month of fasting is prescribed as a religious obligation? Why not just 1 week intermittently, or every other week, or every other day? What is the spiritual objective of fasting, and how can this objective be achieved? And my thunder has already been stolen by that beautiful quote from Maula Ali by Naaznin, that we human beings have both angelic qualities and we have our animal instincts. On a day-to-day basis, our animal instincts overcome our angelic spirits, our angelic qualities, which put a break in our spiritual growth. And fasting is one of those mechanisms where the spiritual dimension of our soul, our existence, can be trained to dominate our animal instincts. So why do people fast, or why should people fast? Now, you can say that people should fast for medical benefits, nothing wrong with it. But most religious traditions, most religious communities fast because it's a religious obligation, because it is what God wants us to do. And whatever God wants us to do is good for us. We may or may not know it. It has taken us over 2,000 years or even more to find out the benefits of fasting. It's also one of the spiritual means to connect with the divine for medical benefits, weight reduction, improving overall health, fighting the side effects of chemotherapy, decreasing the incidence of cancer, decreasing the cancer-related mortality, and the list can go on and on and on. Naaznin also mentioned about its anti-inflammatory benefits. So fasting is a time-honored custom. It's not restricted to Muslims only. Sporadic short-term fasting driven by religious and spiritual belief is common to many cultures. Interestingly, while the rest of the body comes under the attack from the hormonal imbalance, or whatever you want to call it, brain is actually relatively spared. Our brain still continues to function. And the scientists have found that fasting for 12 plus to 24 plus hours triggers autophagy. And this is thought to be one of the reasons that fasting is associated with longevity, not in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality. And exercise, as was mentioned by I think Naaznin mentioned it, exercise for 45 minutes or so before. So exercise can also induce autophagy in some cells, allowing the cells to start the repair and renewal process. So exercising while fasting is not prohibited. In fact, in many of the third world countries, laborers continue to work their usual hours while still fasting. Why do Muslims fast? The primary objective is because God wants us to fast. The secondary objectives we have all discussed. The verses that I wanted to present have already presented by Naaznin. They are in Arabic. The English translation is here, but I don't have to go into it because that has been beautifully explained. The essence has already been captured. Why 1 month of fasting? There is an evolution in Islamic law. Initially, spirituality is a program which cannot be undertaken in an instant, which cannot be completed in a moment. It's an ongoing process. And Islam, like any other religion or any other training program, there is an evolution to that. So initially, people were told about the benefit of fasting 1 day in a year. Then it moved up to 3 days in a month, then 2 days in a week on Mondays and Thursdays, finally 1 entire month. This is a training period. Longer duration would have been harder, and a shorter duration would not have sufficed. And because we are all, the human being, the mankind is one community, God wanted all of us, or at least the Muslims, you can say, to fast at the same time for the same duration of time, rather than it becoming a matter of pick and choose. And I find it similar to 1 month rotation in medical residency, where we were rotating through gastroenterology and endocrinology and so forth for 1 month, because 1 day of rotation or 1 week of rotation doesn't cut it. What's the wisdom behind fasting? As I mentioned, my thunder has already been stolen, but I'm grateful for that. Control of the animal instinct, development of angelic qualities, avoidance of food and water diminishes animal instincts by a mechanism which has already been mentioned, the cortisol levels being low when you wake up. Control of sexual desire through observance of God's commands furthers angelic qualities. Now, there were 2 ways of controlling the eating and drinking when it comes to religion. It could be simply decrease in the quantity, which is not easy. We have seen the beautiful iftar shown by Naaznin. We fast during the day, but we more than make up for it. So extending the interval between eating and drinking was chosen by God to be a better option for doing that. What is the spiritual objective of fasting? I'll be finishing in the next couple of slides. First is it's a means of submission to the divine command. It's a way of connecting with him, regardless of any other physical benefit, not that we exclude it. It's about mindfulness of God's presence, God consciousness, which is taqwa, spiritual growth, self-control and discipline, feeling what the hungry feel, and charity. The last 2 points were already mentioned by Naaznin. And what are the different means to achieving the spiritual objective? And I can tell you that I can give a sermon on each one of them. And actually I've done that, but this is not the time. But there is a change in the mindset. Fasting is an act of submission. Fasting during day and special prayers at night. The nightly prayers in congregation so that an individual becomes part of the community. Recitation of the Holy Quran with reflection and self-introspection, self-control, anger management, waking up before dawn for a light meal called sahri. But in Pakistan, it's no longer a light meal. People actually have what they call sahri parties, where you go to a 5-star hotel, invite your entire community, and spend millions instead of paying that money to the poor. Breaking the fast with the family as one means of communication at the dinner table. Charity, those who have, take care of those who do not have. Feeding the poor through community dinner or iftar with everyone being welcome. Celebration at the end of the month with family, friends, and community to show gratitude to God. Wishing everyone well, giving gifts, visiting family, or calling the loved ones who are away, and remembering the dear departed with fondness and praying for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our wonderful panelists. I think it was really enlightening and very informational, not only from health point of view, but also from overall well-being, which is in a big trend these days, and also wellness, and not to say spirituality. We have a lot of questions. I think many of the questions are endocrinology. It is someone, if you can elaborate a little bit detail how people who want to fast should schedule their diabetic medications. And I think you also elaborated kind of which medications should be changed, which should not be, but maybe we can talk about maybe insulin, basal insulin versus just basic, kind of, because a lot of our audience are non-physicians. I think, sorry, you are on mute. Yes, now I think it's...
So with the diabetes medications, it is very important to make sure that you have at least discussed it with your physician. The question that you need to ask your physician is that out of all these medications, which of these medications can actually give me a low blood sugar? And sometimes I've really noticed, just as an endocrinologist, that maybe a lot of the nurse practitioners or some of the primary care doctors may not know completely, and that would trigger you to perhaps see an endocrinologist. But the two biggest groups are insulin, and then this group of medications called sulfonylureas. An example is glipizide or glimepiride. These medications can actually cause a low blood sugar. Generally, with the insulin, we would at least reduce the basal insulin by 30%. We may have you, if you're taking your basal insulin in the morning, we would want to shift it to the evening because all of your feeding occurs during iftari and then sehri. The mixed insulins peak, they have a peak in them. They're not a stable sort of 24-hour baseline. And those particular insulins really have to be dealt with by an endocrinologist to determine if that insulin can be changed, or perhaps you may not be able to fast if the other insulins are not affordable. There is a very big group of medications called Trulicity. You must see that on the commercials. That's actually a fairly safe medication for fasting because it does not cause a low blood sugar. But the one side effect is that it can cause a bloating feeling or an early satiety. And if you feel like you're not, it may impact your ability to have a proper seri or iftari, because you have to really end up nourishing yourself in bigger amounts at lesser frequency during the 24-hour period. So those are the important considerations. And then of course, that last medication that I was talking about, the Invokana Farxiga, really have to be very careful, because we tell our patients that they have to remain very well hydrated if they use that group of medications.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question is from Syed Rizvi. His question is once a year continuous fasting for 30 days better than fasting once a week, or just spread it out? I don't know who in the panel wants to take this question.
Muzzamal, I can answer that.
Please.
So from a scientific approach, I don't think we have data to say that one particular form of intermittent fasting, if you're focusing on weight loss, is better than the other. I believe, was that the question?
That was the question, yes. Okay, no, thank you. Thank you. And another question from John is, I think for Dr. Chaudhry, for you. How does fasting affect bowel habits? I assume his question is in case if somebody is constipated or something else, and when they are fasting, maybe they have tendency to get dehydrated. So how it can impact bowel movements?
So the problem of constipation often is reported in patients who, especially during the month of Ramadan. And the concept is quite simple. If you're not keeping up with your hydration, and if you're not taking enough fiber in your diet, you might experience constipation, which is defined as change in a bowel habit where you are not going to the bathroom often enough, or you're having harder stools that are difficult to evacuate. So to overcome that, it's important. I believe Beth mentioned 6 to 8 glasses of liquid from any source. It doesn't have to be water. And again, it's a little harder during the month of Ramadan, because if you drink that much water, especially these days, there's such a little time between your iftar and sahri that it's hard to keep up with the required water intake, but do your best. If the question was about diarrhea, generally speaking, fasting, if it's related to the type of food that you're eating, should resolve the diarrhea. If you develop diarrhea while fasting, or if your diarrhea gets worse during the fasting periods, that often is a signal that you need to seek medical attention. So I hope that answers John's question.
I think so. John, if you want to elaborate, or if that was not the case, please feel free to ask. Another question is coming from Nancy Collins. Question is, does fasting decrease the colon cancer? I suppose it can go to both Dr. Khanani and Dr. Chaudhry.
I'm not aware of any study that has shown that fasting will decrease the incidence of colon cancer. It remains to be seen, because the studies are still in their infancy, unless Dr. Chaudhry has some other knowledge of any of the studies that are available in the gastroenterology literature.
So I agree with Saleem that the current data doesn't support that fasting as a sole measure likely prevents colon cancer, but the evolving concept is the change in the microbiome that happens with fasting. That has a signal that altered microbiome may have impact in decreasing the incidence of colon cancer. And another concept is that, as mentioned earlier, when you're fasting, you have less insulin, your insulin sensitivity increases, you leach fat out of the liver, and all these metabolic benefits lead to combating obesity and inflammation in the body, and can in turn translate into probable decreased cancer risk, but we don't have enough data to commit to this.
Wonderful. Another question from John is for Dr. Lokhandwala. Dr. Lokhandwala, what are your thoughts about skipping Sari? Difficult one.
Yeah, that is a difficult one, and perhaps Dr. Khanani could help from more like I've been taught religiously that we should not skip Sari, that my boys have told me, you know, maybe I'll just skip Sari. And we've been told that you at least need to have a glass of water. Otherwise the fast is not complete. So it seems that from a spiritual perspective, we've been taught that we must not skip Sari. From a metabolic perspective, I think that we may have a significant impact on our overall health if we don't nourish ourselves at Sari time. So difficult as it may be, just as from a physician perspective, I would think that it would be better, because we are having to fast for the entire 30 days, that adjusting towards Sari it is a more healthy approach to the full month of fasting, whereas maybe intermittent fasting, if you're only doing it for one day, it may not make such a big difference.
Okay, thank you. Next question I think can go to Beth Cronin. Beth, it's a very interesting and very relevant question. I think you touched it briefly. Can you share some simple Sari and Iftari menu which is good for losing weight? I think you are on mute. If you can unmute yourself, please. Sorry, you are still on mute. Okay. You are on, yes,
Okay.
now you are
Okay.
unmuted. Yes, please.
So
Go ahead.
Siri, maybe a smoothie that has high protein and fruit, or oatmeal with, I would add some dairy with that, some form of milk, or milk, if someone is lactose intolerant, it could be another type of milk. It could be a bowl of lentil soup, which would be fairly nutritionally balanced, perhaps with a little bit of vegetable in the soup. Those would be fairly low calorie, would still have protein and fiber.
Can I interject here?
Yes, please, Dr. Khanani.
Actually, I gave a sermon last Friday and spent quite a bit of time on Sahri, or the pre-dawn meal. So as I mentioned that in the Islamic law, a lot of emphasis is given to the spiritual aspect, and it was left to human intellect to discover the medical benefits of that. So waking up for the pre-dawn meal is not a religious obligation. It doesn't take away from your fast. So your fast is still valid religiously, but it is highly encouraged to wake up. And the dietary advice given was exactly as Beth has mentioned, water and fruit. And the fruit that was chosen was date, because everybody had dates in those days. Now, medically, you can say the water is to prevent dehydration during the day, and the date has complex carbohydrates. So it is not an immediate source of consumption or caloric production. It releases calories throughout the daytime. The other was to introduce sort of a discipline, because we begin our day with our pre-dawn prayers. So Sahri will be eating before you offer your prayers. Now, there are many people who say that, well, we sleep late, we don't need to eat, we are strong, we can manage it. But the spiritual dimension is that this is what God wants us to do. He does not want any hardship upon us. He doesn't want us to get dehydrated. He doesn't want us to become hypoglycemic during our fast. So it's better to start the day with pre-dawn meal. And there is no restriction on what you can or cannot eat. But the minimum that has been recommended is water to prevent dehydration and date to give you some calories.
I see. Wonderful. Thank you. And I think next question probably can go to Dr. Lokhandwala. Dr. Lokhandwala, I think this question is coming from Catherine. Very interesting question. Are the spiritual benefits of fasting likely related to mostly to altered hormone or glucose level or intellectual overcoming of physical slash instinctual desires? I mean, spiritual and hormones. So it's all up to you now.
So, I think that I think this is a very interesting question, and it really stems actually from diets. There are so many diets out there. And when we use the word diet, it often means something that we're just going to do for a period of time. And as Beth and I know, we try to avoid the use of the word diet. We try to use the word behavioral change. And so I do believe for a behavioral change, that sort of intellect and mental strength is what really, so sometimes we wonder, is it the chicken or the egg? And I feel like it is often the mental strength that has to drive the behavioral change. It is amazing, though, that if you can find that mental strength to drive the behavioral change, the physical wellness that you feel from adopting healthier habits makes you actually feel better, and then it makes the process easier. But the initial step has to come from mental strength, and I think that's the and so that even if people are doing intermittent fasting, I try to help them understand that you are actually discovering this power that your mind has, which is limitless. It can make you do whatever you want it to do. And you're not stuck in a box to respond to your instincts, that your mind has a higher capacity. And remember that when you're doing the intermittent fasting, because it is that power that you discover that will drive that behavioral change for a lifetime.
Okay, thank you. I think to elaborate on mental power, I think next question is for Dr. Khanani. From Nancy Collins. My daughter had told me that she's very, very interested in and wishes to fast, but finds it's too hard. Along with her school commitment, I think it's not only her daughter, I feel sometimes. So how do you overcome?
Well, people in Islam, people are gradually introduced to fasting, and it varies from culture to culture. Like usually we say that when a child reaches the age of 7, you introduce them to fasting gradually, maybe half an hour a day, 1 hour a day, eat one candy less. So it's kind of a gradual process. But once you have reached a certain age, which is the age of puberty, you are required to fast unless you have a medical illness that prevents you from fasting, in which case, you can pay some compensation like feeding the poor. But it obviously, it takes practice, it takes time. And interestingly, I think it's a very interesting observation that the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to have a practice. He encouraged that fast more during the 2 months preceding the Ramadan, so you get into the rhythm of fasting. So during those 2 months, people may fast for, let's say, part of the day only, half a day only, quarter of a day only, and just get into the schedule of that. But again, if somebody finds it very hard and they are not able to do that, God understands.
Okay, thank you. And next question is from Muhammad Naveed. He mentions, I didn't see the picture or reference to pakoras, or I will probably add samosas too. It's probably a question for Beth Cronin. Naaznin can probably help too if Beth doesn't clearly understand pakoras or samosas. I mean, I think her dietary advice was very different from sometimes what traditionally is eaten at iftari, especially pakoras and samosas. And sometimes maybe that's a reason of not losing weight. If people want to fast and also want to lose the weight, is that the reason in your opinion? Or, I mean, what is there any other cause for not losing weight?
Yeah. Beth, you go ahead. Do you know what pakora and samosas are, Beth?
I do not. I saw the picture, so I got the impression that it had extra hidden sugar and perhaps extra fat. I'm not sure.
So actually, pakoras are flours that are fried.
Okay.
So there's really a problem with the fried the fried, because first of all, there's very little fiber and there's no water in these fried products. And there was a little box that just popped up there that somebody was asking, what kind of foods can I eat to prevent dehydration? And that's exactly the kind of foods that you want to avoid, because there is very little fiber, there's no water, and so it's okay to have it in a small portion. So the portion control is very important with these very calorically dense foods, but it should not be the mainstay of what you eat.
Thank you. I think the same second component of this question was about the soft drinks. That could be just plain Cokes or soft drinks. And sometimes what I have also seen is people adding a sugar to the milk and mixing with Coke, commonly known as dud soda. Maybe Dr. Naaznin, you can also help Beth. And what is your recommendation about all this carbonated sweetened drinks?
Go ahead, Beth.
Okay, so
yeah,
we have kind of a standard line with medical nutrition therapy that all foods fit, with the exception of these sugary beverages. I truly do not recommend sugary beverages for any of my clients, but especially in diabetes. First of all, they are calorie dense and not usually nutrient dense. There might be some atom, like vitamins or something added to a sugary beverage. They do tend to cause, I believe, the sugar blues. There's an immediate rise in blood sugar after drinking a sweet beverage. And someone who does not have diabetes, I would presume, would make insulin promptly and lower their blood sugar. But many times that leads to then a lower blood sugar or a very quick decline in blood sugar, and leaves a person feeling, perhaps tired or much like the hypoglycemic response that people with diabetes may have when their sugar goes too low. So I just don't believe in sugary beverages in general. I think that especially with fasting, it's important to have things that carbohydrate sources that are lower glycemic. And that's a term that we use for those carbohydrates that have a very slow, gradual effect on blood sugar rather than a spike. And that would confer also to grains, whole grains rather than refined grains, fruits and vegetables that are closer to their natural state rather than highly processed. And certainly with beverages, staying away from all sweet beverages.
I see. I think we have a lot of questions, but I am quite cognizant of our time. So maybe we can continue for another 10 minutes and then we will say, and if somebody wants to leave, they can feel free to leave. But I think questions are quite relevant and interesting. If panel is okay, I can continue.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And believe me, I'm not trying to discriminate Dr. Khanani and Dr. Chaudrey. For one reason or other, there are more questions for Dr. Lokhandwala, so I have to continue. So next question is also for you, Dr. Lokhandwala. For someone who is diabetic and who attempts to fast, what should be their clues? It's not safe. They should break the fast.
So again, if they're on insulin and a sulfonylurea, if they notice during the fasting day, so they should. I think that there should be no problem with them checking their blood sugar. I don't think that that's a problem at all. I don't. I would definitely recommend my diabetic patients that if they're feeling unwell during the fast, that they should check their blood sugar. But the typical symptoms of hypoglycemia would be an extreme feeling of hunger, palpitations, a cold sweat. And in that case, I think that they really should check their blood sugar if they have a glucose meter, and they should break their fast. They must break their fast. If their blood sugar is less than 100, I do think that they should break their fast. So I think that it is important to have a glucose meter with you at home with testing supplies. Again, extremely important if you're on insulin or any of the sulfonylureas that you've talked to your physician before you embark on fasting. And that physician really has to work with you according to your body's constitution, what your kind of meal planning is. It is completely different for somebody who wants to drink a glass of water at Sari versus somebody who's willing to fully nourish at Sari time. So the whole plan has to be individualized. I'd like to say that I would be happy to be a resource for APPNE if there are any patients that APPNE sort of embraces and they're looking for endocrine help during the month of Ramadan. Maybe every Friday, I'd be very happy to give some time if there are any questions to help patients, because I know that there are not a lot of endocrinologists, and then it's tougher still yet if you want to fast, and many endocrinologists must say, oh no, you're crazy if you want to fast. So I certainly I would try to give you my very best advice.
Okay, thank you. And now we have one question for Dr. Chaudrey. In regards to intermittent fasting, after how many hours of fasting in a day in general do you see helps in terms of losing weight? This is from Saud. I think his question is probably how short fast he can have and still lose the weight.
So again, the studies that are available have used variable durations for fasting, ranging from 8 hours to 20 hours or so. And all of these durations seem to, as I mentioned earlier, not definitive but variable outcomes. So generally speaking, your stomach takes about 4 hours to empty all the solid food. So by 4 hours, you still are, churning the food that you ate, solid food predominantly. Liquids are almost gone within 20 minutes or so. So if you really want to use fasting to your advantage, I would say that probably the best minimum is anywhere between 8 to 12 hours for weight loss.
8 to 12 hours, wonderful. Another question, I'm not familiar with this, it's from Adika Bhatt. Her question is coconut water preferred to water for its electrolyte content for Dr. Khanani?
Religiously, there is no restriction on what you can drink and what you cannot drink outside of obviously the prohibition of alcohol. But conceptually, and my younger colleagues may be more up to date on this thing, that water is hypotonic. So when you drink water, it gets into the cells and keeps the cells hydrated while you are fasting. On the other hand, if you are taking anything which is hypertonic, it will draw the water out of the cells and make them dehydrated, while you have no option of replenishing by drinking water during the fasting period. In terms of the electrolyte, dates are rich in potassium as well as in glucose, which is gradually released, so it will not draw the water out all in at once. But again, as I mentioned, religiously, there is no restriction in what you can drink.
Thank you. I think we are coming towards end of our question. Dr. Khalil Khatri, he has asked, can I inject Botox in a Muslim patient during Ramadan if he or she is fasting? I think I can probably extend the same question. Can somebody get, which is quite common these days, can somebody get a COVID vaccine if the patient is fasting? Maybe for Dr. Khanani.
There is no restriction religiously. What is prohibited during fast is eating and drinking. Nobody takes a COVID vaccine or any vaccine for its nutritional benefit. Mm-hmm. Similarly, there is a question of what about an asthmatic patient? Can he use an inhaler while he's fasting? Obviously, he can use it. saving life is more important. And the inhaler in no way goes down into your stomach as food source to break your fast. So these questions have been asked, and the scholars more or less unanimously say that these medical things are allowed, like just like brushing your teeth using toothpaste, so long as you're not swallowing it.
I see. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think Tahir Ali had another question. What kind of food can we eat that can prevent dehydration? It had already been partly answered. So I'm going to probably, I thank you everybody, and especially panelists and very active audience with so many questions. And with that, I think we will adjourn our webinar. Thank you. And we are looking forward to have hopefully another informative webinar, maybe on COVID, but thank you everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Appreciate everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you.
One
Thank
question.
you, doctor.
This is going to be recorded and it's going to be put on YouTube. So, and then I'd like to also thank a reporter from Booster Telegram. She's attending this seminar. She is doing a report on fasting in Ramadan. And I told her that this is a good time to join us also because this will be related to that. So thank you very much, Ms. Samir. So.